when I let these familiar parables of Jesus happen to me this week. A single line whistled through my head over and over again. Grace never gives up. Grace never gives up. Grace will chase you for your whole life. Grace will look for you when you're lost. Grace will forgive you when you're dead wrong. And grace will give you another chance, and another chance, and another chance, and another chance when you need another chance. I often need another chance. Grace never gives up. My earliest lesson in the notion that grace never gives up, I learned from my dad. When my little brother and I were little boys, we're 18 months apart, and we ran thick as thieves when we were little boys. When we were little boys, my dad said, "Boys, you can play anywhere you want on the property, but you're not allowed to play in my lawnmower shed." So as soon as Dad turned his back, where did we go? The lawnmower shed, baby. Straight there. True story. One day, Dad turned his back and we went straight to the lawnmower shed. We found his lawnmower in the shed, and we pulled the dipstick out of the oil reservoir in the lawnmower's engine. Do you know what I'm talking about? That cylinder that sort of sticks up on the side of the engine. We pulled the dipstick out, and then we got the bright idea to fill the now empty space where the dipstick's supposed to be with dirt and leaves and tiny twigs and little bitty pebbles. Y'all got a lawnmower, don't you? I have no idea what we were thinking. It was an objectively terrible plan. After a little while, my father came looking for us. You know, Dad doesn't see his little boys for a little while, and Dad comes looking for the little boys, and he found us in the one, I'm sure he went straight there too, he knew us. He found us in the one place he told us not to go, the lawnmower shed. He found us, and along with us, he found his ruined lawnmower. And he hung his head. Oh, I can see it in my mind's eye. He hung his head. And I used to say I can only imagine how disappointed he must have felt, but I know how disappointed. I own a lawnmower. If Jesus Christ himself came back today and filled my lawnmower's oil reservoir with dirt and leaves and little tiny twigs, I would be utterly frustrated, irritated, disappointment. My father hung his head. And I remember realizing, this is one of my earliest memories, I remember realizing when I saw his reaction that what we'd done was just not good. But the further realization for me, and the real takeaway, was I was amazed that he didn't kill us. And not only did he let us live, but I have no memory of like some kind of ferocious punishment. He didn't met out any kind of ferocious punishment at all. Grace never gives up. That little story, I often say, is the earliest proof I have in my own story for the existence of a loving God, because I remember even at that tender age thinking that my dad had to have learned how to love and give grace from somewhere, from someone, and that someone must be God. And if my dad could love us anyway and give us such grace, then how much more must God love us and give us grace? So 30 years later, 30 years later, I tell that story in a sermon. The story of the two little boys, the lawnmower, and the dad who gives grace. I tell that story in a sermon I preached down in East Tennessee, where I'm serving a little church in McMinn County. And there's a young man in the congregation the day that I tell that story who had just gotten out of prison. He was a newly sober resident in our recovery shelter. We called it the Grace House. And he'd been in prison, this young man had, for a year for robbing a bank in our little town. And he got caught robbing that bank because his plan was terrible. He tells his story very publicly on himself. The young man wore very distinctive glasses. And he figured that if he took off his glasses, people wouldn't recognize him. And that's how he'd rob the bank. So he rode his bicycle up to the bank one afternoon, and he took off his thick glasses before going inside. He went inside, robbed the teller, got $500, then bolted out the doors, hopped on his bike, and immediately ran into a car that he didn't see because he didn't have on those glasses. He hits the ground, he gets caught, and he gets carted off to jail. He serves his time. He serves his time. He's released back out on our streets, and he finds his way to the Grace House, our recovery shelter. And I watched this young man. I immediately loved him. He did really well. He worked the 12 steps. He got a sponsor. He went to meetings. He got a job. He started coming to our little church. And that's how he heard the story about the lawnmower and grace. And I saw him just about every day. And I got to watch this man become a leader. And we got to be close. And then I moved up here to Kentucky. And I lost touch with him. But he went looking for me. He sought me out. He found me here. And he wrote me a letter. He wrote me a letter, longhand. Put it in the post, and it arrived here to me. And his letter happened to arrive on a day where I was feeling down. You ever have a tough day where life's just roughing you up and you're feeling a little down? Well, that was the day that I was having when his letter arrived. And I opened up his letter, saw in the return address my old friend. And his letter said this: Dear Hendree, I love and miss you and your family. I'm ever grateful for God's grace and love. And I thought to myself, baby, grace never gives up, does it? I'm doing really well, he continued. I just worked my 12th step. I can't believe the life I have now. It is so good. He continued, I went to church on Easter Sunday where you used to preach. And as I sat there, all I could think about was you putting all that dirt in your dad's lawnmower and him not killing you and your little brother. You got grace then, he wrote, and I have it now. The letter continued, I sat in the middle of the church surrounded by all those good people. And I thought to myself, I not only belong here, but I want to be more like these people. LOL. It was a pretty surreal moment. And then he closed the letter. Thank you so much for listening to the call and doing what was yours to do. I pray that I can do the same. With love, Jack. Grace never gives up. Can you see the path? The winding journey grace took over decades. 2 little boys ruining their father's lawnmower, him not killing them. Grace never gives up. 30 years later, a drug-addicted bank robber with a famous methamphetamine habit. Here's a young preacher telling an old story. And it flips a switch in him. Grace never gives up. A couple of years after that, he's not a bank robber. That's a distant memory. He's a sober man working his 12th step. And the 12th step is taking the message to others, being helpful. He's not a bank robber anymore. He's helpful. Grace never gives up. And that cat, that beautiful man, writes to me. He's got no idea I'm having a tough day. He writes to me, and he picks me up with the same grace. With the same grace that my dad gave me when I was a little boy. My dad had been dead at that point for a dozen years. But grace never gives up. And he was still, through Jack, giving me grace. Grace never gives up. Don't you dare, beloved of my own heart, ever let anyone tell you that the gospel of Jesus Christ is some complex affair. It is a fundamentally simple and life-saving message, this gospel of ours. And it is this: grace never gives up. Today is Rally Day. In the life of our parish, it's the day where we launch formation with a focus on our children. And if we don't teach our children anything else, let us teach them that grace never gives up. That they will get lost, they will fall down, they will mess up, they will execute terrible plans. But grace never gives up. Grace never gives up. This is the good news. Grace never gives up. Amen.